Blazing Magnum, the crime film from 1976, was an official co-production between Italy and Canada. Yeah, Canada. But how did that partnership happen? During the 1960s, the genre side of the Italian film industry was booming on the world stage. It had been doing well since 1958's Hercules, which ushered in the sword and sandal films, followed by the spaghetti westerns, which were popular the world over, including even the United States. Now, part of the way that Italy achieved this worldwide success was through co-production partnerships, sometimes by way of official international treaties. And this practice went all the way back to 1949, when Italy signed a co-production treaty with France, and then the other Western European countries followed. But as the 1960s rolled over into the 1970s, the Italian westerns were waning in popularity, and the New York Times ran a series of articles using their correspondent in Rome, Alfred Friendly Jr., describing how the Italian film industry was suddenly hurting. The replacement action fad to the spaghetti westerns turned out to be the Italian crime films, the poliziotteschi, and they did not become popular in the all-important American market. So I guess it was time to find some new co-production partners, some new countries to make movies with. Now, jumping ahead to the 1980s, Italy had a very successful partnership with the Philippines, which made total sense. It was a cheap country for producing movies, and it had jungle climates that were perfect for some of the big Italian rip-off trends of the 1980s. The Indiana Jones copies, or Jones clones, as I like to call them, and the Italian Vietnam movies that came in the wake of Platoon. But back in the 1970s, Italy struck a partnership with Canada, a couple of countries that don't, at first glance, seem to make a lot of sense together. So what was the attraction on the part of the Italian film producers to working with the Canadian film industry? Well, as best I can tell, it's because Canada was a country that took the arts very seriously. And so they dedicated a lot of legislation and governmental resources to making industries like cinema flourish, much more than just the infamous tax shelter law we've all heard about. So let's look at the films that Italy made in Canada, or with Canada's help, during the 1970s. Films like Blazing Magnum, YETI, STATELINE Motel, Angela, Twilight of Love, and more. So like I said, Canada was a country that wanted its artistic industries to flourish. In 1967, the Canadian government created the Canadian Film Development Corporation, which was founded to support the production of feature films in the country. And Canada signed a lot of co-production treaties during the 1970s, starting with a co-production treaty with Italy in June of 1970. But if I understand that treaty correctly, it didn't come into full force and effect until 1974. And meanwhile, this Canadian Film Development Corporation was not considered a success in getting featured films off the ground in the country. Yeah, the Canadian film industry was getting off to a slow start at the beginning of the 1970s. An article in a May 1973 edition of the Montreal Gazette detailed the stories of 3 sets of Canadian film producers. They were each having a hard time attracting the sort of director they desired to come make a film for them in Canada. Now, one cinematic subgenre that was booming the world over in the early 1970s was the Northern Wilderness movie, or the Mountain Man movie. One such movie, the American-made Jeremiah Johnson, starring Robert Redford, was a huge surprise commercial hit, and another one, The Call of the Wild with Charlton Heston, was apparently a big hit in Italy. So the Italians started cranking out more movies of this type, a lot of them based on the eponymous wolf dog of Jack London's White Fang stories. And since at least 2 of them, Challenge to White Fang and Redcoat, are set in Canada, you might think that'd be a good co-production opportunity, and some online sources hint that the exteriors of those 2 films were filmed in Canada. But there's also a lot of conflicting information, and in the end, I don't think they were made in Canada or with any Canadian involvement. Too bad. So let's move on to an Italian film that verifiably was shot in Canada, a crime film called STATELINE MOTEL, aka Last Chance. It starred Eli Wallach, who's better known from the spaghetti westerns, Fabio Testi, and Ursula Andress. You see, the replacement action movie fad in Italy to the spaghetti westerns were the crime movies. It was a fad that dominated Italian action cinema from roughly 1973 to 1980, called both poliziotteschi in Italian parlance and Eurocrime, retrospectively by English speakers. So what lured this Italian film to Canada? Well, STATELINE MOTEL was actually based on a novel that set the action in the United States, but stories are sometimes more dramatic when set along borders, and this screenplay came up with a good premise, that a recently released American ex-con who was given 48 hours to leave Canada, well, he'd be a good candidate to smuggle hot diamonds over the border. Nobody would think to search him, he was just following orders and getting out of the country. So the film version was set in Montreal and Knowlton, Quebec, the latter of which being a town not far from the US border, just north of the American state of Vermont. And the rewritten story fully embraced the new setting. Within the first 2 minutes, some dialogue announces the fact that they're in Canada, and a few minutes later, you see a billboard for the Montreal Star newspaper. STATELINE MOTEL was reportedly shot in both Canada and Rome, and a lot of Italian films that were shot on location abroad would do the exteriors in that other country and do the interiors back in a studio in Rome. I'm not sure if that's what they did on STATELINE MOTEL, but if they did, that means they flew the local Canadian hire, Celine Lomez. Always hire a local star, it just makes good business sense. That means they must have flown her back to Rome because her character works at the motel, and so all of her scenes are interiors. But in any case, the movie sort of fits in this little subset of the Italian crime films, the films that were largely shot at a single location. Italy had to produce a lot of films to keep up with the public demand, and one cheap corner-cutting way was to set a film largely in one location. The genre would end up using this trick again, like in Corrupt with Harvey Keitel, where much of the film took place in an apartment, and Terrorism with Luke Morinda, where much of the film takes place in an apartment. And of course, in STATELINE MOTEL, it's mostly at the motel, which is really closer to the description of an inn, not a motel. So Italian filmmakers were making a film in Canada with an international cast. Did that get a lot of attention for the Canadian film industry? Not really. The main press that STATELINE MOTEL got was in gossip columns. Yeah, the leading lady of STATELINE MOTEL, Ursula Andress, was going through a series of high-profile boyfriends at the time, and STATELINE MOTEL marked the production where she broke up with Hollywood actor Ryan O'Neal and began dating Italian actor Fabio Testi, her co-star in this film. And I don't think the film was a hit, not in any part of the world. So Canada was still missing some sort of puzzle piece to really kickstart film production inside its borders. And all sorts of ideas were floated around, including the idea of imposing a quota on Canadian movie theaters that would have required them to show Canadian films as a certain percentage of their overall movies. But the thing that finally did the trick was 100% tax write-off being offered to investment in Canadian-made motion pictures that was passed in 1974. 100% write-off of the money you invest. This is what is considered the beginning of Canadian cinema's tax shelter era, although it's worth noting that Canada did actually offer a 60% tax write-off on film investments before it got up to that 100%. And a couple years later, the tax shelter was expanded to include investments in short films and shot-on-video movies. So the Canadian film industry was finally ramping up. In 1975, another Italian crime film, this one a much bigger deal to the Canadian film industry, started shooting in Montreal, a cop film called BLAZING MAGNUM. The film's Italian producer had actually toured Canada before the big tax shelter law, thinking he would scout locations in Toronto, Ontario, but was convinced to check out Montreal, the biggest city in Quebec province, instead. And once the movie was underway, the Canadian producer, because there's a Canadian producer and an Italian producer, was very excited that this Italian director, Alberto Di Martino, was going to be shooting in Montreal, thinking that BLAZING MAGNUM might be a great showcase for the city, that Montreal might get discovered as a movie town. In any case, it was funny that Di Martino, was in town shooting an Italian Dirty Harry-inspired film right as his previous film, an Italian Exorcist-inspired film, was playing in the local Montreal cinemas. I've actually found a page from the Montreal newspaper, the Gazette, which has an article at the top of the page about Blazing Magnum's exciting local production, and right beneath it is a review of that previous DiMartino film, The Antichrist. It's a mixed to negative review, but I imagine that critic would have been even harsher if the director hadn't been in town. So, how did Montreal look on camera? Well, you know how cop dramas typically take place out on the gritty, mean streets? Well, Blazing Magnum, being shot in Montreal, seems to be taking place on these sparkling, clean streets. Yeah, everything looks fresh and tidy in the Montreal depicted in this crime film. Even the subway bathroom doesn't look grungy, and the location manager apparently needed to find construction sites in order to get anything that doesn't look really pristine. There had been a lot of money pouring into Montreal in the years leading up to the 1976 Olympics, presumably with a lot of development, so maybe that explains why the city and all its buildings look so new and sparkling. And yeah, there's even glimpses of Olympics posters in frame during Blazing Magnum. But there were still plenty of Italian qualities about the production. The Italians are very notoriously loose about getting things like permits and permissions, and true to form, Blazing Magnums began rolling cameras without the necessary permits to film its car chase, and that's despite the fact that the car chase is the most showcased set piece in the film, costing $200,000 of the $1.5 million budget. And plenty of other Italian qualities too. As demonstrated by the film's two most common English language titles, Blazing Magnum and Strange Shadows in an Empty Room, the film incorporates elements from two popular Italian fads of the day, the cop movie fad and also the giallo fad, which were the stalk and slash thrillers. They were almost a prototype to the American slashers of the 1980s. And the scene where the protagonist fights some trans women, well, that's basically one of the stock scenes from the 70s crime films that were made in Italy. Even though I read a great thesis paper by a Canadian graduate student, and he thought that fight scene was an acknowledgement of Montreal's cabaret drag scene. Now, what was the breakdown of the cast? Well, the cop hero was played by Hollywood actor Stuart Whitman, who was apparently bored with Montreal because the newspapers reported that he spent all his time on the phone with women back in Los Angeles. Carol Lowe was the big Canadian hire in this film, and although she was another attractive brunette, sort of similar in appearance to Celine Lomez of STATELINE MOTEL, she is not just a supporting character. I'd really say she has the most critical female role in the entire film. John Saxon played the cop's sidekick, and he already had a precedent with both Canadian cinema and Italian cinema, so it made plenty of sense that he would be there. Yeah, by the time of Blazing Magnum, he had already been a cop in the 1974 Canadian film Black Christmas, and he had already starred in the Italian crime film I Kissed the Hand from 1973. I think the next Italian-Canadian film would be the silly monster movie YETI, Giant of the 20th Century. The early variety ads for YETI proclaimed things like, filmed entirely in the Canadian North. And that would lead you to believe that it takes advantage of Canada's most snow-covered regions. But no, the opening footage of glaciers all looks like stock footage, and then when the story gets to Toronto, everything's green and grassy as if it's springtime. But it's nice to see Toronto in this film, as most every other Italian-Canadian film from this period was shot in Montreal. Anyway, this goofy Italian film does not want you to forget that it's shot in Canada. The Canadian flag, with its bright red maple leaf, is in the background of shots to a comical degree. Canadian flags everywhere. It feels like they're in half the shots in this film. And the name of the corporation that is profiting off the discovery of the YETI is Honeycutt Enterprises. Is that an in-joke to the previous year's Blazing Magnum, in which one of the lead actresses was Gail Honeycutt? Were there so few Italian-Canadian films that they went around referencing each other? YETI was directed by Gianfranco Parolini, who had directed Lee Van Cleef in the comedic Sabata spaghetti westerns. But YETI, with its monster costume and its miniature effects, felt like a new level of silliness for the director. It's hard to believe these old-fashioned special effects were hitting the big screen in the same year as Star Wars. Now, YETI was surely meant as a low-budget cash-in of the 1976 version of King Kong, which was made by Italian film producer Dino De Laurentiis in the United States as a big-budget American film. And, oh, here's something interesting. I found a trade announcement that De Laurentiis himself had intended to follow up his King Kong with his own take on a YETI film. He was going to shoot his in the Himalayan mountains, but maybe he shut the project down when he realized he'd be competing against this Italian-Canadian-made YETI movie. Maybe. Now, one of the biggest producers in Italian film history was Carlo Ponti. Like Dino De Laurentiis, he sort of transcended just being an Italian producer, was eventually seen as an international producer, but he had worked with Italian greats like Fellini and De Sica. Now, in the middle 1970s, he started developing projects with Canadian tax shelter funds, and in the year 1977, Carlo Ponti had no less than 3 Italian-Canadian productions in release. Twilight of Love was one, and it was the only one that didn't star Sophia Loren, Ponti's wife. It was filmed partly in Montreal, and it concerns a 50-something advertising executive becoming obsessed with a 20-something woman that he hires to model for a perfume campaign, and Pam Grier, billed for some reason as Pamela Grier, shows up to run around in a bikini. One of the locations that gets featured in a big sequence is the Montreal Forum, the famous indoor hockey arena and music venue. The film does a great job of making the Forum seem huge and crowded, and I guess that's the point of the sequence, because the young model and the older ad exec catch a hockey game there, but they get separated in the crowd and spend the whole game on opposite sides of the arena. The Forum must have been a real attraction as a location whenever foreign filmmakers came to Montreal. 2 years later, when some French filmmakers made the Montreal-set crime thriller Jigsaw, starring Lino Ventura and Angie Dickinson, they also set a sequence at the Forum. And the original script for Blazing Magnum had a scene set at the Forum too, but it was changed to a university football stadium for the actual shoot. Now, likely, the main reason anyone would track down an obscurity like Twilight of Love nowadays would be to see vintage footage of the Forum. Another Carlo Ponti co-production was A Special Day, and it was one of the 13 on-screen team-ups of Italian acting legends Sophia Loren and Marcello Mastroianni throughout the decades. Special Day is about 2 neighbors who meet for the first time on the day that Hitler came and visited Mussolini in Italy. See, the man and woman meet because their entire apartment building is virtually empty, with everyone attending a big military parade. Even though the entire film is set in that apartment building, another one-location movie for the Italians, and they probably could have figured a way to cheat some Canadian interiors for the Italian ones, the film was shot entirely in Rome. Yeah, the only 2 things represented in Canada were 2 cast members. 1, the woman who plays the resident busybody in the building, and 2, John Vernon, the famous Canadian actor who had some Hollywood success in films like Point Blank and Dirty Harry. But John Vernon is only in the film at the very, very beginning and at the very, very end. And he had to learn his lines in Italian. Ponti got in trouble for how little Canadian involvement was actually in A Special Day. So he was required that his next Italian-Canadian finance film, Angela, be shot in Montreal with more Canadian participation. One almost wonders if the whole film was just made as a contractual obligation to pay penance for A Special Day and its lack of Canadian elements. Like maybe Carlo Ponti had to quickly throw together another film project to keep the Canadian government from being angry. Anyway, the film Angela, it's just a thin reworking of the Oedipus myth, and even though the story has 2 sections set 20 years apart, Sophia Loren and John Vernon are of totally unconvincing ages to pull off the earlier, younger parts. But the movie doesn't seem to really care, and yeah, Sophia Loren and John Vernon are again a couple in this film, making it feel as if just the 2 nearest actors were cast out of convenience. And when the respected Canadian director they had hired, Sidney J. Fury, bailed on the project for a better offer, they could only get a TV director, Boris Sagal, to take his place. Sophia Loren was reportedly very unhappy on set, and Carlo Ponti didn't even put his name on the production. When the film got its official home video release, a picture of Sophia from Man of La Mancha was used instead. I know that some Canadian films during the tax shelter era were not undertaken for reasons of art, but still the whole Angela project just feels uninspired. When a certain other project was announced in 1977, it looked as if we might get a third Italian crime film co-produced with Canada in the 1970s, Covert Action, aka Spy Kill. Here's how it was announced in Variety. The male leads were to be Hollywood actor David Janssen and homegrown Italian hero Maurizio Merli, and the female lead was to be Barbara Bach, who was actually in the STATELINE Motel cast previously. Since Covert Action had a little espionage mixed into its crime formula, I guess it's fair to say that Barbara Bach made a slightly more famous secret agent film around that time, The Spy Who Loved Me, and that might have prevented her from being in Covert Action. Anyway, Covert Action ended up being made with those two male leads, a different actress, and it ended up being an Italian-Greek co-production instead of an Italian-Canadian one. So Angela wasn't the greatest film in the world. Covert Action didn't even get made in Canada after all. It was not an auspicious end to a decade of filmmaking partnership between the two countries. And then Canada's 100% tax write-off ended in 1982 when it was reduced to a 50% tax write-off. And that's considered the end of the golden age of the tax shelter films and of Canadian genre cinema. Italy would sign additional co-production treaties with Canada through the years, and occasionally a film would get made between the two countries, like the 2001 Joe Mantegna film Vendetta, which is perhaps most notable for being an early role of Superman actor Henry Cavill. So there you have it, the Canadian-Italian filmmaking cooperation that yielded movies like Blazing Magnum. That film obviously doesn't feel like a stereotypical Eurocrime film, and yet it has enough of the Italian genre staples that it's not like any other Canadian film of the time either. It has its own je ne sais quoi, so I'm glad it was made. Now, Canada also had a tax shelter for investment in livestock breeding. Did you want me to talk about that?